Hi, my name is Alex Carstensen, and today Angie and I will be talking about work investigating cross-cultural differences in reasoning, vision, and social cognition through replication. Cultures vary widely in their values and behavior, and psychologists have devised measures of these differences for decades, resulting in a substantial literature. Comparisons between the United States and China have been especially well researched, with differences attested in a range of cognitive domains, including visual attention, language learning, executive function, relational reasoning, similarity judgments, values, preferences, and self-concepts. Many of these differences can be broadly construed as differences in attention and reasoning, such that people in the US tend to show a preference for focal objects, characters, and information, like this cat, while those in China are relatively more likely to attend to background and relational information in visual context, as well as narratives and other formats. As a result of this large body of research on cultural differences, the US and China are increasingly becoming major cultural poles in efforts to assess and measure differences and correct for the pervasive bias in psychological research toward weird samples. Despite the long empirical tradition and abundance of psychological accounts for these cross-cultural differences, there are many remaining obstacles to cross-cultural comparisons. Specifically, there's little consensus on how to map between cultural constructs and measurements. The research linking between cultural tasks is correlational and often does not control for other factors, putting causal inference on shaky ground. It's difficult to aggregate and compare data across customized methods, languages, and populations, making for apples to oranges comparisons between and even within studies in some cases. And finally, much of the literature predates recently raised methodological issues, like the practice of using pre-registrations to limit analytic flexibility. For these reasons, replication of previous cross-cultural results would provide important confirmation of the robustness of these effects. We set out to do so with a systematic replication of a set of cross-cultural tasks in an online format. Beyond replicating influential previous work, we had a few additional goals that factored into our task selection. Because of ongoing work, our team has a particular interest in relational reasoning, so we sought out tasks showing cross-cultural differences between the US and China that may be relevant to relational reasoning. Second, because our long-term goal is to understand the developmental trajectory of these differences, we chose tasks that are, at least theoretically, appropriate for all ages, from early childhood through adulthood, though all of the participants in this study were adults. And finally, we chose implicit over explicit cultural measures to minimize task demand confounds and link to other implicit reasoning tasks, as previous work has shown that explicit and implicit measures of culture are often surprisingly uncorrelated. So here's a brief roadmap of our tasks. First, we used an ambiguous relational match to sample task to measure biases in relational reasoning, the cross-cultural difference that we're most interested in. Next, we included several tasks designed to assess differences in visual attention. In each of these tasks, we predicted, based on previous findings, that participants in the US would show more attention to focal information, and those in China would show relatively more attention to relational and contextual information. So for example, in describing this scene, we predicted that American participants would be more likely to mention the cat first, relative to Chinese participants. And finally, we included several tasks tapping into social cognition and values. Our prediction for these tasks paralleled the visual tasks, that participants in the United States would be more likely to attend to focal information. For instance, when asked to explain a character's behavior, we predicted that American participants would more often cite personal causes, like the girl's preferences, while Chinese participants would be more likely to mention situational constraints outside of the girl, like the condition of the bike or the weather. Our study included these 7 tasks and an additional exploratory task, all of which were run online in a counterbalanced order. We recruited 200 participants in the US and China through snowball sampling seated at major universities. And after exclusions, our final sample included 167 adults in China and 169 in the US. Before diving into the specific methods, I'd like to highlight that we did not find cross-cultural differences in most of the tasks. And I'll speak to some possible reasons for this at the end of the talk. With that, I'll turn this talk over to Angie for the specific methods.
Now, I will give a more detailed deep dive into the task we used and the results. To echo what Alex just said, out of all the tasks we selected, we only successfully extended the past cultural differences finding in the free description task. In the free description task, participants saw a series of pictures for 5 seconds each. After the picture disappeared, the participant described the pictures. This design was originally used to compare context sensitivity between 4 to 9 years old children in the US and Japan. They found that US children are more likely to mention the focal object first, whereas the Japanese children are more likely to mention the background objects first, suggesting a higher degree of sensitivity toward contextual information. We successfully extended this finding to our sample. US adults were more likely to mention the focal object first. For example, when describing this picture, Chinese adults were more likely to mention the lake first, and US adults tend to mention the plane first. Here, we plotted first mentions in each sample, with data from China in red on the left and US in blue on the right. The y-axis shows the proportion of focal first mentions, so you can see that US participants mention the focal object first on almost all trials, whereas participants in China show a nearly uniform distribution. This finding is consistent with the idea that East Asian participants are more sensitive to background information than Western participants. Our second visual task was the Ebbinghaus illusion. In this, participants judge which of the two circles is the bigger circle. In the baseline block, participants just saw 2 orange circles, but in the illusional context block, the orange circles are surrounded by gray circles, and on most trials, large gray circles are used to dwarf the bigger orange circles, making it appear smaller to create the illusion. In previous work, Japanese children were more susceptible to the Ebbinghaus illusion, consistent with the prediction that people from East Asian cultures are more sensitive to contextual information. We did not extend this finding to our sample. Our participants showed the Ebbinghaus illusion and did so to a comparable extent across cultures. The x-axis here shows the objective size difference between the 2 orange circles, so trials on the left were most difficult. The y-axis is accuracy, so in the right panel you can see that responding was near ceiling except in for the hardest comparison. In the illusion condition, performance is much poorer across the board, but similarly so for both groups. The third visual attention task is the picture collage. Participants put stickers on the canvas to make a picture. There is also a line representing the horizon. In previous work, school-age children from Japan and Canada showed 3 key differences in constructing their collages. Japanese children tend to use more stickers, cover a great area of the scene, and place the horizon higher than Canadian children did. These results are consistent with predictions that East Asian participants will tend to include more contextual information in their artwork, suggesting an emphasis on context over decontextualized focal objects. We did not extend this past finding to our sample. The number of stickers, area covered, and the height of the horizon were similar for both groups in our study. The y-axis here, we plotted the height of the horizon for participants in each group, and you can see that the 2 cultures performed very similarly. In the first social task I will discuss, we asked participants to select a sticker as a prize. One of the options was a different color from the other 4. Previous work has shown that European American adults are more likely to choose a unique sticker than East Asian American adults, suggesting that European American adults prefer the unique choice more than the harmonious one in this context. We did not extend this finding to our sample. You can see that both Chinese participants and US participants prefer the unique sticker to a similar degree. In the second social task, participants drew themselves and their family members as circles. Previous studies have shown that American adults tend to draw their self-circle larger than the circle they draw for others. This finding has been interpreted as showing that American adults express a higher degree of symbolic self-inflation than adults from East Asia, in this case, Japan. Again, we did not extend this finding. Chinese and US participants drew circles for themselves and their social networks that were comparable in size. The last social task examines causal attribution. Participants watched an animation in which 2 girls played in the pool but both avoided playing on the bike. Participants were asked why the characters didn't play on the bike. Previous work has shown that Chinese adults tend to make more situational attributions, such as because bikes are dangerous, but US adults tend to make personal attributions, such as she's shy or doesn't like bikes. We did not find cultural differences in our sample. Plotted here are the numbers of attributions participants made, with personal attribution in the left panel and situational in the right. Both groups tended to make more situational attributions. Finally, we used the ambiguous relational match to sample task to test for preferences in relational reasoning. In the training phase, participants saw 2 pairs of objects activate the machine and 2 pairs that didn't. The training data was ambiguous. It could be a single block, the blue square here, causing the machine to activate, or the different relations instantiated by the causal pairs. Then, at test, participants are asked to select which pair of the novel objects will make the machine play music. Previous work has shown that young children in US favor the object match options, whereas kids in China prefer the relational match option. We did not extend the pattern to our adult comparison. Here, the proportion of relational matches is shown on the y-axis. Both Chinese and US adults showed similar preferences for the object match solution. As an exploratory measure of relational reasoning, we also included the Riven's progressive matrices set E. Previous work has found that Chinese adults outperformed US adults in this task. We replicated this finding, but cautioned against interpreting it. The difference we observed does not necessarily speak to cross-cultural differences in relational reasoning, because there are several confounding factors that we have not ruled out. For example, there may be cross-cultural variation in familiarity with the task or in practice with standardized tests, which are very popular material for prep courses in China. As a quick recap, out of all the tasks we run, only the free description tasks show the interpretable cross-cultural differences.
Okay, so now I'd like to briefly discuss our results and put them in context relative to the existing cross-cultural literature. Our study only found cross-cultural differences in one of the 7 main tasks that we included, which we found surprising. As a disclaimer though, most of these results are non-extensions rather than direct non-replications. Several of the studies we adapted were originally run with young children, and it may be that adult performance was at ceiling on some of these tasks, or simply that some developmental differences do not persist into adulthood. Another possible explanation for our non-extensions is cultural heterogeneity. A number of the studies we draw on attested differences between East Asian and Western cultures other than those in our sample, mainly Japan and Canada. Although most of the cultural constructs implicated in these studies are linked broadly to East Asian and Western cultures, it may be that cultural heterogeneity within these samples plays a more critical role in determining generality than we anticipated. Finally, some of the studies we build on were published more than 20 years ago, around the time that most of our participants were born. Accordingly, it may be that globalization processes over the last 20 years have diminished the size of cultural differences attested in the previous generation. While all of these factors may help to explain the lack of cross-cultural differences seen here, the sparsity of cross-cultural differences observed in our study is dispiriting and indicates that measuring differences in cognition based on the previous literature may be non-trivial. Despite these challenges, we're currently running a follow-up study to examine developmental trajectories in the US and China on many of these tasks, which we hope will elucidate the nature of both the cross-cultural differences we did observe in our adult sample and those we did not. Thank you all so much for your attention, and we're happy to answer any questions.